In the year 890, a Norwegian chieftain named Othere walked into the court of King Alfred of Wessex and did something no Viking had done before in the historical record. He sat down and explained, in plain terms, how he made a living. Not with a sword, not with a saga, with a calendar. He told Alfred about his farm in Hålogaland, in northern Norway, where he kept cattle and sheep and 600 reindeer. He told him about hunting walrus for their ivory and their hides, and about a voyage he had taken north around the top of Scandinavia, partly from curiosity and partly because walrus ivory fetched a good price. Alfred's scribes wrote it all down in Old English, and the manuscript survived. We have a Viking's own words describing his economic year to a foreign king. What Othere described was not a warrior's life. It was a portfolio. And here is where the title of this video needs to be corrected, because the correction is more interesting than the claim. The popular idea goes like this. Vikings farmed for half the year, and when winter came and the seas calmed down, they launched their raids and expeditions. It sounds logical, it sounds balanced, and it is almost entirely backwards. The North Atlantic in January does not calm down. It tries to kill you. Wave heights in the Norwegian Sea between October and March average 4 to 6 meters. Storm frequency doubles, and daylight above the 60th parallel drops to 5 or 6 hours. Norse ships, for all their brilliance, were open vessels. Crews sat exposed to spray, wind, and cold, with no decking over their heads. A winter crossing from Norway to England was not bold seamanship. It was suicide. Vikings sailed in spring and summer. The same months, they needed to plow, sow, tend livestock, and, above all, cut hay. That is the real story. Not a neat division of the year into work and adventure, but a fierce compression of both into the same narrow window of navigable seas and growing weather, roughly late April through September. How an entire civilization managed that impossible scheduling conflict is what the next 20 minutes are about, and the answer involves more slavery, more desperation, and more ingenuity than the romantic version allows. You know the feeling of having too much to do in too little time, of stacking obligations into the same week because the calendar does not care about your preferences. Scale that sensation across an entire culture, anchor it in a landscape where the margin for failure was death, and you begin to understand the Norse world from the inside. Start with the land. Norway's cultivable territory, even today with modern drainage and fertilization, is roughly 3% of total land area. 3%. The rest is mountain, glacier, bog, and forest. In the Viking Age, before any of those improvements, the fraction was smaller. What arable land existed was scattered in narrow strips along fjords and river valleys, separated by terrain that took days to cross on foot. The growing season in southern Scandinavia lasted perhaps 150 days. In northern Norway, where Othere lived, it might be 100 or less. Barley was the primary grain crop across most of the Norse world, for one reason. It could mature in 90 days. Oats and rye supplemented it in some regions, but barley was the staple because it was fast. You planted it the moment the ground thawed. April in Denmark, May in central Norway, sometimes June in the far north, and you harvested it before the first frost, or you lost everything. But grain was not the critical crop. Hay was. This is the detail that reframes the entire Viking economy, and it is the one that popular culture never mentions. Norse households kept cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and those animals were the real wealth of a farm. They provided milk, cheese, butter, meat, wool, leather, and manure for the fields. And every one of them needed hay to survive the winter. The hay harvest in July and August was the single most labor-intensive period of the Norse year, requiring every available hand: men, women, children, thralls. Archaeological excavations of Norwegian and Icelandic farm sites have revealed that hay barns were often the largest structures on the property, sometimes bigger than the longhouse where the family lived and slept. If the hay harvest failed in August, the cattle died in December. And if the cattle died, the household might follow. Now hold that urgency in your mind and add this: the sailing season peaked at the same time. The best weather for a North Sea crossing, a raid on the English coast, or a trading voyage to Hedeby fell in the same June through August window when every farm in Scandinavia was desperate for labor. A longship crew of 30 to 60 men represented 30 to 60 pairs of hands not cutting hay. The tension was structural, built into the geography and the climate, and every Norse household that sent men to sea had to solve it or starve. They solved it in ways that are less comfortable than the adventure story. The first solution was division of labor within the household. When the men sailed, the women ran the farm. This was not a secondary role. The Old Norse term husfreyja, house lady, denoted genuine economic authority. A husfreyja managed the thralls, directed the fieldwork, oversaw the dairy production, conducted local trade, and made the daily decisions that determined whether the household would survive until spring. The keys she carried at her belt were not symbolic. They unlocked the storerooms where the food supply was kept, and controlling access to stored food was controlling the fate of every person on the farm. The second solution was thralls. This is where the story gets honest. The Norse economy depended substantially on enslaved labor. Thralls, the Old Norse word is threll, were a legally defined class in Norse society, documented in law codes, in the poem Riksthula, and throughout the sagas. They were captured in raids on Ireland, the British Isles, and the Slavic lands. They were bought and sold at markets from Dublin to Birka. The Dublin slave market, under Norse control through much of the 9th to 11th centuries, was one of the largest slave trading operations in early medieval Europe. The ability of free Norsemen to leave their farms for months at a time depended in part on enslaved people maintaining agricultural production in their absence. This is not speculation or modern projection. The connection between raiding, slave-taking, and agricultural labor is documented across multiple independent source traditions: Arabic, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Norse. The seasonal cycle that looks like freedom from one angle looks like extraction from another. Somebody had to run the farm while the free men sailed, and that somebody did not choose to be there. Iceland's founding population around 930 is estimated at 9,000 to 20,000 people. Genetic and archaeological evidence indicates that approximately 10% were thralls, many of Celtic origin, Irish and Scottish captives, or their descendants. The parliament they founded, the Alþingi at Þingvellir, is rightly celebrated as the oldest continuing parliamentary institution in the world. It was also an institution from which thralls were excluded. The third solution was selectivity. Most Norse people never went on a raid in their lives. The image of universal Viking warrior culture is a distortion. The majority were full-time farmers who never left their home region. Raiding required access to a ship, a leader organizing an expedition, and a household stable enough to survive the absence. A young man from a small inland farm with no connections to a chieftain with ships simply did not go. The Viking Age was made by a minority of the population, while the majority stayed home and grew the barley that made everything else possible. But for those who did go, the rewards were real, and the social logic was powerful. The Old Norse word vidforli means wide farer, and it was a compliment. A young man who returned from a voyage abroad came back not just with silver, but with knowledge, connections, stories, and enhanced marriage prospects. The sagas present overseas travel as a form of education for young men roughly 16 to 25 years old. In Egil's saga, the young Egil Skallagrimsson is restless, hungry for the world beyond his father's farm. In the Vinland sagas, the expeditions to North America are driven by economic ambition and social competition in equal measure. The pattern is consistent. Travel built the reputation that converted into political influence and advantageous marriage alliances back home. Raiding in this framework was graduate school with an axe. The silver that flowed back to Scandinavia from raiding and trading was staggering in scale. Over 80,000 Islamic silver dirhams have been documented in Swedish hoards alone. Coins struck in the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and Samarkand and other mints thousands of miles from Scandinavia, carried north along the Volga trade route between roughly 780 and 1000. Each coin is datable by the caliph's name stamped on it. Together, they document a single economic network stretching from Northumbria to Central Asia. That silver funded bride prices, political alliances, ship construction, and land acquisition. It was the venture capital of the Viking world, and the sailing season was when you raised it. Now, the title says the other 6 months were for raiding and exploring. The calendar says differently. So what did the Norse actually do when the fields were frozen and the ships were hauled up into their boathouses? They worked. Winter in the Norse world was not hibernation. It was the season of making things. Archaeological sites at Rib, Birka, and Kaupang show craft production concentrated in the cooler months. Metalworking, woodworking, boat repair, weapon maintenance, tool forging. Textile production intensified. Women spent winter evenings at the warp-weighted loom, an upright frame with stone or clay weights hanging from the threads, producing the wool cloth that was both a household necessity and a major trade commodity. In late winter, February through April, cod fishing intensified along the northern Norwegian coast. Small 4-oared boats called fairings went out on dark, cold water, men hauling handlines in near-freezing conditions, bringing back the protein that would see the household through to spring. The cod were split and hung on wooden drying racks to become stockfish, air-dried cod so durable it could be stored for years, so nutritious it sustained sailors on long voyages, and so valuable it would later become one of medieval Europe's most traded commodities. This was not leisure. This was February survival. And then there were the feasts. The Yule feast, Jol in Old Norse, was the central social event of the Norse winter calendar. A multi-day gathering involving communal drinking, gift exchange, alliance building, and the performance of skaldic poetry. But Yule was not celebration in the way you might celebrate a holiday. It was political technology. The chieftain who hosted the most generous feast, who distributed the most arm rings, poured the most ale, fed the most guests, gained followers for next summer's expedition. Generosity was power. A stingy chieftain lost men to a generous rival. The longhouse in midwinter, smoky and dim, with only the central hearthfire and a few whale oil lamps pushing back the darkness, people crowded onto raised earth benches along the walls. A skald standing by the fire reciting verse. That room was where next year's raids were funded and crewed. You have been in rooms like that, in some diluted modern form. The dinner where the real business happens. The gathering where alliances shift over drinks. The Norse version operated on the same social mechanics, compressed by darkness and cold into a few intense winter months, with the stakes measured in ships and sword arms rather than contracts. The German chronicler Adam of Bremen, writing around 1075, described the Norwegians as people forced by poverty of soil to seek livelihood abroad. He was not romanticizing them, he was diagnosing a structural economic condition. When your arable land is 3% of your territory and your growing season is 100 days. You diversify or you die. Raiding was diversification. Trading was diversification. Mercenary service in the Byzantine Varangian Guard was diversification. Settling new land in Iceland, Greenland, and briefly Newfoundland was diversification. Every overseas venture was an attempt to solve the same basic equation. This land cannot feed everyone it produces. That equation drove the Viking Age. Not bloodlust, not wanderlust, not some innate Norse hunger for conquest. Arithmetic. Too many people, too little farmland, too short a growing season, and ships good enough to reach places where the balance was different. The ships themselves were winter products. A gnaw, the deep-hulled merchant vessel that carried settlers to Iceland and Greenland, took months to build. The keel was laid from a single oak trunk, split with wedges and shaped with axes and adzes. The hull planks were riveted in overlapping clinker construction, caulked with tarred animal hair. The mast was stepped amidships, carrying a single square wool sail, often undyed or in muted earth tones. Every plank, every rivet, every rope was produced or maintained during the months when sailing was impossible. Winter built the summer. Consider Othere again. When he described his life to Alfred's scribes, he was not describing a warrior's existence. He was describing risk management across seasons and geographies. Reindeer here, walrus ivory there, a trading voyage south when the margins looked favorable. Tribute collected from the Sami people to his north, farming as the base, with every other activity layered on top as insurance against the base failing. He was, in terms a modern listener would recognize, running a diversified portfolio in a high-risk environment with no safety net. The difference between Othere and you is not ambition or intelligence. It is that Othere lived in a world where the calendar itself imposed a rhythm of intense outward activity followed by intense consolidation. And that rhythm was non-negotiable because the climate enforced it. You live in a world where the calendar has been flattened. 50 weeks of the same work, 2 weeks of something else, in a cycle that repeats until the career ends. The Norse seasonal pattern was not leisure. It was not work-life balance in any modern sense, but it contained a structural assumption that most modern economies have abandoned, that a full life includes periods of going out into the world and periods of making sense of what you found there. The Havamal, the Old Norse wisdom poem preserved in the Poetic Edda, opens with advice for the traveler. Look carefully before you enter a hall. Check every doorway before you walk through. You never know where an enemy may be sitting. The entire moral framework of the poem assumes a world of people in motion, arriving at unfamiliar places, reading rooms for danger and opportunity. Travel is not the exception in the Havamal. It is the default human condition. Staying in one place is what requires explanation. That was 1,000 years ago. The longhouses are archaeological footprints now. The ships are in museums in Oslo and Roskilde. The trade routes are airline routes. The thing assemblies became parliaments. The stockfish is still produced in northern Norway, hung on the same style of wooden racks, dried by the same Arctic wind, though now it ships to Italy and Nigeria rather than to Viking Age market towns. But the calendar question Othere answered for Alfred remains open. How do you organize a year? How much of it do you spend producing, and how much do you spend venturing? The Norse answer was not romantic, and it was not clean. It depended on enslaved labor, on women bearing the full weight of farms for months at a time, on young men risking death at sea for silver and reputation, on a landscape so demanding that staying home year-round meant poverty. It was a system shaped by constraint, not ideology. And yet, somewhere in that system was a structural truth that the modern 50-week work year has quietly discarded. The Norse assumed that leaving home was part of how a life was built, that returning with something, silver, knowledge, stories, a name earned abroad, was not a vacation from real life, but the other half of it. The next time you look at your annual calendar and count your days off, consider this. You are not short on ambition. You are not short on curiosity. You may be short on a culture that treats the outward season as essential rather than optional. The Norse had that culture. They also had a 100-day growing season, a 3% arable landscape, and ships built by hand in the winter dark. What they did not have was a single month with nothing to do. If you have visited any Norse site, Jorvik in York, the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, Thingvellir in Iceland, Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, tell us in the comments what it felt like to stand where they stood. And if this is the kind of history that earns your time, subscribe. There is more of the documented record to walk through, and the Norse left a long trail.